Let's just strip back all the noise, all the details, all the deeper sort of intellectual, philosophical viewpoint for a second, and let's just look at racism in its most basic definition, its most basic form. It is holding prejudice against someone because of the color of their skin. That is basically the core issue of racism, isn't it? So I made that video about police power, brutality, and the issues around that. I think there's good officers and bad officers. I'm seeing a lot of videos showing, for example, officers reaching out to black communities, actively engaging with the communities. I've also seen other videos showing the police in a less glamorous light. Um, so I hope I covered a lot in that video. I know, just a word, I know I've been making videos recently that have been a bit on the longer side. I've been averaging about 20 minutes. I I think that's unavoidable because there is so many issues to cover. One reason I've never used Twitter is precisely because it's so condensed, and I don't think you can sum up a lot of these issues in just a few words. But with racism, I do think that is the basic definition. Holding hostility or prejudice to someone because of the color of the skin. Now, with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, one of the explanations or the retorts from the movement when people are criticize it for being for promoting double standards, like all lives matter, they said okay, but Black Lives Matter at this particular time. Um, I understand what they're saying, but whatever way you gloss it over, the narrative is that we're only focusing on Black lives. Now, the problem with the movement, as I see it, is that's their mantra. But it's not just that it's only focused on black people, it's also that it isn't focused on all black people. The focus is only on black people who have died at police hands. Anthony Joshua briefly mentioned the problem of black youth gang violence, but how much candid discussion is there within the black community about the negative influence of drill music, for example? How much candid discussion is there really about the problem of black on black crime? You will get black figures speaking out about it, but as a movement, I think for Black Lives Matter, it has been a secondary issue. Their entire focus has been about the narrative of racist white cops killing black men. I think of all socio political issues, there is none as volatile as the issue of race, particularly in the United States. I mean, every country has a particular issue that's sensitive. With America, I think it's fair to say that no issue is perhaps more sensitive than that of race. I mean, okay, the gun issue, the abortion issue, those issues are all definitely hot topics, but I'm not sure that anything polarizes opinion so much, inflames passion so much as the subject of race. And I would say that's true to some extent in the UK. We had, of course, the Brexit debate, that was the big hot button issue here, but now race is once again becoming an issue. The movement Britain is not innocent. Their whole thing is about saying Britain also has a racism problem. What is true is that Britain has also had a history of racial tensions. We're not totally free from it. As an example, the Birmingham district of Handsworth, that one district has had at least four different race riots in, I believe, 1981, 1985, 1995, and 2011 during the England riots. I might be slightly wrong on those dates, but that's just one neighbourhood. I was trying to do research on Britain's worst race riot. I'm not sure which one it is. We've had plenty of them. In 1919, just after the First World War, there were serious race riots in Welsh ports at Cardiff and Newport and Swansea. Um, and of course, in 2001, the riots in Bradford and Oldham. Often in Britain, the violence hasn't just been between white and black, it's also been between the South Asian community and the black community. I remember when I was at Wolverhampton, we done a case study of a black newspaper, that is, it was black folk, it's called The Voice, which ran an inflammatory article accusing Asian men of raping a black girl. Um, and that basically caused some serious disorder at the time. I think it was in the Lawsels district, not Handsworth. I believe it was Lawsels or Aston. I can't recall now. But we use that as a case study of responsible versus irresponsible reporting. Now, with racism, I'm seeing a lot of attitudes that I do not think are helpful. I'm seeing some white people who are really, really endorsing the Black Lives Matter movement, and I've seen them holding placards like because of white privilege, I will learn about racism, I won't experience it. Now, that sort of mentality from white liberals and from minority racists, actually, that white people can never be the victim of racism is wrong. I'm going to quote at least three murder victims in this country who were victims of racially motivated attacks, and they all died. Three young men. Ross Parker in Peterborough, Chris Donald in Glasgow, and third victim, just get his name up, it was in London. Just bear with me a second. These were three racially motivated murders of young white men. Um, so Chris Donald in Glasgow in 2004 was killed by a gang of Pakistani boys. Ross Parker in Peterborough in 2001, and Richard Everett in London in 1994. Three young white men murdered for no other reason than they were white. Now, look at the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which was a very high profile case and got a lot of attention. Brutal murder, racist murder for sure. Um, but major media outlets in the UK got criticised for their lack of coverage of those other three murders, particularly that of Chris Donald. So I think this lends into a fundamental problem here in that if, as a society, we are to say that we need to stand against racism and racist attitudes, the focus seems to be entirely on white racists. Now, just to be clear here, just to be absolutely clear, I have no allegiance to and no sympathy to white neo Nazi thugs. So the likes of Combat 18 and other white nationalist groups, they can go to hell as far as I'm concerned. I have nothing to do with them. Their mentality is alien to me. Okay? Um, they are nothing but trouble. And I am not interested in arguments coming from far right sources. And yes, the far right is real about white genocide and so on. That is to say that the country's been overtaken and the white people are going to be exterminated. And there's very dangerous and false narrative coming from certain far right factions that people need to be very wary of. But what I have a big problem with is this mentality that minority people cannot be racist. They can. They can. And I am sick and tired of seeing certain minority racists, or at least race baiters, getting a green light just because they're writing for The Independent or The Guardian. An example of this is Avu Hirsch. Whenever she writes on issues of race, she speaks in very, very polarizing and inflammatory terms about basically white people in general. When you get a publication like Why I No Longer Speak to White People About Race by Renee Edo Lodge, my question to white liberals who support this sort of narrative is, well, where do you stand with something like that? Because She is basically saying if you're white, you're the problem, whether you agree with her or not. So I think it's fundamentally a bit foolish to endorse this sort of racial identity politics in that sort of way. And I think it's misguided to say that if you don't endorse the mentality of, for example, Black Lives Matter or other identitarians, then you are somehow apathetic to racism or you're blind to it. My position is that I condemn racism, period. I don't care who's coming out with it. I don't care what their background is. I don't care who they are. Racism is racism is racism. Yet it is a fact that only certain kinds of racism get discussed. I mean, if we want to be really meticulous about this, we can look at, for example, sectarianism within the Muslim community. It's more sectarianism than racial, but that's a very serious problem. We can look at attitudes that some South Asians have to black people. We can look at attitudes some black people have to South Asians. That's a serious issue. But it infuriates me that minority races basically get a free pass. Sarah Jong, who is, I understand, of Korean descent, uh, hit notoriety a few years ago when she wrote a very, very inflammatory piece about all white people, describing white people in general as goblins who need to hide underground. What happened? The New York Times gave her a job. They made a kind of half-hearted apology. Now, her official excuse was she was simply retorting to some right-wing trolls. But if she was simply responding to right-wing trolls, why the collective attack on all white people? Why not just them? Why not just focus on them? That's the problem. So it is irrefutable that there are double standards when it comes to minority racists. And these white liberals who basically defend it or make excuses for it, I find them infuriating because they are promoting those double standards. They're promoting the divisions. By the way, when I'm talking about divisions, this is not to say that there aren't real issues. It's not to say, oh, can't we all just get along and pretend there's no problems? There are problems. But I would like to see more honesty in terms of the discourse. And my issue with Black Lives Matter is some of their narrative is absolutely generalizing in its pitch, but it's also it's not looking at the whole situation faced by black people. It does downplay black on black crime, which is a major source of young black men being killed. It just is. There's no getting away from that. And what I really, really find problematic is when these identitarians push out this message of white privilege. I've explained in the previous video why I feel that is such an inflammatory term because it is generalizing. It's the only racial slur that is generalizing an entire ethnic group. It seems to be acceptable. So why is it okay to say to a white person, I am going to judge you because you're white, therefore I will assume you're privileged, you've never experienced racism. They might have done. They might have had insult thrown at them by a Pakistani guy. Who knows? And it may be that there's a valid argument to make that, okay, white people haven't had the same sort of institutional racism. But I think it is very dangerous to say that because of white privilege, white people can't be victims of racism. Tell that to the parents of Chris Donald, Ross Parker, and um, and Richard Everett. You know, that's that's why this idea that white people can't be victims of racism is just categorically untrue. Now, it may be that white people are not going to have the same sort of problem with racial profiling. I accept that there are issues around that are controversial. And I'm not of the opinion that black people are problems are entirely of their own making. I do think there's problems with racism. I do think some American cops are racist. I do think some British cops are racist. I remember I was with a Ghanaian friend in Wolverhampton, and he'd accidentally taken a wrong turning. We were driving for a night out, and he'd taken a wrong turn into I know it was an area where you weren't supposed to drive, but it was an honest mistake. He'd misread the sign, and an officer pulled up. He immediately apologized. He said, "Sorry, officer, it's a mistake." Now, the attitude that that officer showed was definitely not professional. Um, and I overheard racial slurs. Now, my friend at the time, maybe he'd missed them, he didn't make an issue out of it. But I am not in denial that there are racists out there. But I think it is so dangerous to present this narrative that minority people cannot be racist and white people cannot be subject to racism. Collectively vilifying an entire race is racism. And I'm sick and tired of people like Afua Hirsch who basically think they can get a green light to be derogatory about all white people. Um, you see, as a white guy, I'm not speaking from a point of white pride. I'm not speaking from a point of, you know, I demand respect because I'm white. I'm saying I demand that people do not prejudge me because I'm white. They don't know what my situation in life has been. You know, for all they know, I could have been homeless for 5 years. I haven't. That that isn't my story. I could well have been. And I just think that race baiters, put it plainly, I think they're despicable. And I think there are segments of the media that don't help because they don't show the whole picture. CNN, I believe, has a lot to answer for in this. I'm not criticizing them for covering the issues that Black Lives Matter are concerned about. That's not what I'm criticizing. I'm saying they should show the whole picture. So, where is their condemnation, for example, of black racists? There's been some troubling placards appearing in some of these rallies that are basically advocating violence against all white people. And these white liberals, I mean, I think back to the civil rights movement, there were some white people who were actually murdered in their efforts to support Martin Luther King's movement. There was a young Italian American woman by the name of let me just get this right, Viola Liuzzo. She was murdered by Klansmen. And another victim was a young, I believe he was a Boston clergyman by the name of James Reeb. Just double check that. I'm just literally, yeah, James Reeb. These are two young white people murdered by Klansmen because they went down to the South to support the civil rights movement. So when I'm talking about white liberals, I'm not attacking white people who are opposed to anti-black racism. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about this new generation of virtue signaling white liberals who are endorsing double standards. They're going well beyond just saying, look, we recognize there's racism and we stand against it. There was even footage of the Black Israelites, which is a fringe organization. They are black supremacists. Some white people were actually kissing their feet. I thought, no, this has to be made up. This has to be some sort of joke. No, it was for real. Done a bit more research. It was for real. Um, I just cringe with certain white people who think that the way to combat racism is by endorsing the white privilege narrative and by basically just groveling. It's pathetic. I'm afraid I've no respect for that. By the way, those who pulled down the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, noticeably, most of them were white. Interesting. There's, by the way, about the Colson statue, there was already a new plaque, as I understand it, on the statue detailing his role in the slave trade. But basically, I'm of the view that a country like the United States of America has undeniably had a racist history. No question about it. I mean, I've seen those photos of the lynching victims in the Deep South from the 1920s and the 1930s. Well, from, they went right through from the 1890s to the 1920s, peak of the lynching period. I've done research on this, so I know what I'm talking about. Um, and what happened of the estimated 4,000 plus lynchings, fatal lynchings, there was a very heavy concentration of black victims in the Deep South. Out in the West, the majority of victims were white, but there was also Chinese victims, there was Italian victims, there was Jewish victims. But in the Deep South, the majority of victims were black. Now, that sort of thing was happening well into the 20th century, and it was stomach churning, stomach churning. There would be actively law enforcement involved in the lynchings. People would come out like it was some sort of day trip to see a young black man basically stripped naked, and literally in one case, the case of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas, 1916, literally dipped up and down in a fire. Stomach churning, barbarism, absolutely on par with anything ISIS has done. That was happening well into the 20th century. So I am not in denial about that side of America's history, but I don't think it's enough to say, well, that's what the evil white people done, even though there were white people who opposed it. Therefore, let's hate all white people. I mean, I've heard this argument of black rage as a legal defense, which is basically because of 400 years of the wicked white man putting down black people. Well, my clients can be defended because they just snapped. I think it's uh, it's a problem as a legal defense because if you want to get into injustice in history, where do you draw the line? Because you can go back and look at slavery in all sorts of societies throughout history. And if you want to get really, really, go really far back, one could argue that because of Viking pillage in the region that I am in, maybe the northeast of England should demand reparations from Denmark and Norway. Now, of course, that would be absurd because it was so long ago. But my point with that is, where do you start to say, where is there a common sense red line applied here? Where do you say today's generation are responsible for what happened in the past? Where do you say, to what extent are we being honest about this versus, a kind of collective blaming? Um, my position has always been that societies need to be honest about their past. So the United States has to be honest about its history of Jim Crow laws, slavery, discrimination, and I think actually it is. I mean, unlike China, American filmmakers, documentarians, writers have extensively explored this stuff. I'm not going to say there's never been censorship. I'm not going to say there's always been candid discussion about it. That's not the case. But I do think if you look at how these things are approached in the United States or the UK versus a country like China, we are a lot more honest about our past. Same with the situation in Britain. Um, the idea that British people aren't aware of the slave trade is nonsense. It's just not true. Um, but I think that with racism, it's such a toxic thing because if you treat someone differently because of their demographic, so if you say to a white person, "You're white, therefore I'm going to treat you differently because you must be a racist," then they're going to get defensive, and they're going to be on the defensive. So it's a cycle. You're not interested in dialogue. You're just interested in putting them up against this charge. It's no different from saying all black people are criminals, which of course isn't true. I mean, I think this is even more, it's even more inflammatory than the sexism battles, the way some feminists will always approach men from a point of view, it's because you're a man. When you approach people that way, when you start off dialogue by trying to get the other person to feel guilty, then there is not going to be dialogue because the other person is going to be defensive. Maybe they shouldn't be defensive, but it's human nature. No one likes to be made to feel guilty. It's human nature. But more to the point, it's also, I think, wrong to say to a person, because you're white, or because you're a man, in the case of the sexism arguments, you must just listen to my lecturing of you. You must just accept it. As a white person, what's my responsibility? My responsibility is to be honest about the history of institutional white racism, which is true. My responsibility is to speak out against white racists. That's what I see my responsibility as. I do not see my responsibility as apologizing for what happened 300 years ago. And I would also say, if we're going to have a consistent approach, then black community leaders need to be calling out black racists who want to demonize all white people. Asian community leaders need to be calling out Asian racists. You can find bigotry in every community. And anyone who says that only white people are racist, they're part of the problem. They're not helping a damn thing. I could talk about this a lot more, but I'll leave it there because, you know. But fundamentally, you have to you have to approach this, I think. Well, rather, I won't tell other people how to think, but I approach this. I approach this by saying, I treat people as individuals. If someone holds hostility to me because I'm a Westerner, or I'm white, or I'm a man, or I'm heterosexual, that's their problem. I know what my values are. I know how I treat people, and I'm prepared to give anyone the benefit of the doubt. I would be fully willing to listen to a Black Lives Matter activist, for example, as long as they didn't come into the discourse by trying to shame me as a white person, because that would be just, well, where are we going to get with this if you just want me to bow my head in shame? It isn't going to work. That's what people need to understand.